Whoops. Okay, good morning, everyone. Good morning again. Welcome to Monday. Welcome to Monday. I'm not sure if I have anything exciting to pass along to you. I guess next Monday it'll be a long weekend. Next Monday is Family Day here in BC, so we'll have a 3-day weekend. So that'll be nice for all of us to have an extra day to rest and relax and sleep and eat and things like that. It'll be quite cold in Vancouver this week, so make sure you bundle up. Temperature is going to go. Apparently, it's going to go down to -10, which it apparently hasn't been -10 in Vancouver since 2008. So super cold, unless you're from Alberta, and then it's not really that cold. But anyway, it'll be a little bit cold this week, so bundle up. Okay, let me say good morning to some people who are here. So Irene is here. Good morning to you. Adon is here. Good morning. Good evening, I guess, to both of you. But Baha's here. Good morning, Baha. I don't know who this is, Ashkur Raphael, but if you're in this class, maybe let me know who you are, and that would help. But good morning. And Michelle is here. Good morning. Good morning to you, Michelle. Let me see, Friday. Oh yeah, on Friday we were talking about the Egyptians, and we were talking about their ideas of the afterlife and a little bit about religion and mummification, right? And so we said the Egyptians had this very rich idea of what their afterlife would look like, and it was probably very much like the life they already lived, which is kind of interesting, right? So think about it. You're going to die, and you could go to any kind of paradise that your culture can imagine. And what do they imagine? Well, they imagine a life that's very similar to what they already have, which says a lot about how they were living their lives, right? The Egyptians felt that you could take it with you, and so often Egyptians, particularly pharaohs, were buried with things that they could use in the next world. And so part of that had to do with preserving their body, because the body was important as a seat for the soul, and so for them to kind of exist in the afterlife, their body had to be preserved here. And we saw, we'll talk about shortly, a lot of work went into preserving the body. But they're also buried with all kinds of things, right? Like furniture and clothing and jewelry and food and wine and chariots and all the kinds of things they would need to kind of live their life again in paradise, in the afterlife, right? Again, mummification started out, well, mummification was kind of a natural process, right? If you die in the desert and you bury someone in the sand, they probably will, to some degree, dry out and mummify because it's super hot and super dry. And so people were kind of mummifying naturally in the desert anyway, but the Egyptians kind of developed a system to sort of help that along, right? And so I'm going to jump ahead a little bit because I asked you some questions here, and some of these were answered in the video and some of them weren't. And so the first one definitely was not. And this mat thing is kind of, oh gosh, how do I explain it? It's represented in art as the feather. So you remember we've seen a couple of scenes of, you know, the dead person's heart being weighed in the afterworld or in the afterlife, and they're being weighed against the feather of truth. That feather of truth is mat, and it is kind of like the universal concept of balance. Okay, it's the force that kind of holds the universe together. It's a universal principle of balance, right? And so again, you'll see that kind of abstract concept reflected as a feather sometimes, and often it's shown kind of being weighed against the heart of the person. And that's how people were judged, right? People were judged based on their heart, right, and their deeds, and whether they spoke the truth, right? Whether they were good people who, you know, followed, you know, honored the gods and took care of their families and did what was right, then they would be able to, their heart would weigh appropriately, and then they would be able to enter the afterlife, right? Do you remember this from Friday? What kind of information we received from DNA evidence? Oh, okay, yeah, we heard about that with regard to the Pharaoh Tutankhamun, right? And we did a bit of a, he's been studied very extensively. So he's been through an MRI machine a number of times, and he's been X-rayed, and he's had his genome sequenced and all kinds of things. We actually know, good morning, we actually know quite a bit about Tutankhamun and who he was and what his general health was like, right? And so we kind of know who he was related to. We know he had some genetic diseases that may have been a result of inbreeding and his, ancestors marrying their sisters and cousins for generations. That's usually not a good recipe for health. Did we learn anything about Ramses II in those videos? I know I wrote these questions and then I swapped videos in and out. So there was some videos that answered this question and maybe not. Let's see. Well, what else did we learn about Tutankhamun? Jeanette, not a healthy guy. Was young? Yeah, was young, yeah. So becomes pharaoh probably when he's 8 or 10 years old, and then dies when he's about 18.
He's famous, like he's known now.
Yeah, so super famous kind of in sort of our cultural knowledge of ancient Egypt, and also very significant to historians and archaeologists. But at the time, kind of not that big a deal. Right? He didn't really do much. Again, he was a kid for most of his reign. And so yeah, didn't really do much, not that important. Died quite young and unexpectedly, it seems. Was buried in, a tomb that wasn't really a pharaoh's tomb. It was probably the tomb of a noble that was just kind of hurriedly finished and stuffed in there. Yep.
Is he famous because he died young, or is like the place was buried?
He is famous because he is the only Egyptian pharaoh to be found in a tomb that is almost perfect. So it was robbed just a little bit thousands of years ago, and then it was totally forgotten about and hidden. All of the other ones were robbed in antiquity, and by the time sort of scientists who were, coming to Egypt in maybe the 1800s to actually study it, everything was gone. It was just they're just empty rooms. So he's the only one to be found mostly intact. That's why he's famous. But basically every other pharaoh would have had a tomb and, things buried in the tomb that would have been, 10, 20 times what anything we see in Tutankhamun. Tutankhamun's tomb is just like probably the worst one. Morning, Sophie. Probably the worst one. But again, it's the only one that we have discovered mostly intact, and so it tells us the most. Why did Egyptians stop burying pharaohs in pyramids?
Because the thieves, the pyramids are no place for buried pharaohs, so they steal them easily.
Yeah, it's a big billboard, right? The pharaoh is buried right here, and inside, it's going to be, there's going to be riches, there's going to be treasure, right? And so, again, so many of these things are getting robbed thousands of years ago that, they try to sort of, the Egyptians try something in order to keep these tombs from being robbed. And so they put them in this valley. The valley is under guard, so nobody can get in or out. The tombs are covered over so that it's not obvious where they are if you're just walking through. But unfortunately, even that doesn't work.
There's a hole also in the pyramid now.
What's that?
There's a big hole on the pyramid itself.
Yeah, they're still discovering little passageways and things inside it, right? I still don't think that anything has been found, like any kind of artifact, but they're still mapping them out.
Before, like, they used to allow people to go inside,
Mm-hmm.
but now they're not allowing it. I don't want the reason.
And it's, well, I don't know about the pyramids. It is that way with the tombs. And the problem with the tombs is that when you get a lot of people walking through there day in and day out, they're breathing, and the water vapor in their breath sticks to the walls, and then it allows mold to grow, and mold pushes the paint and plaster off the wall. And so the more people that go in there, the more the paintings actually degrade. And so some tombs are not open at all. Some tombs are only open for a while, and then they close them so they can go in and clean off the mold. And yeah, the paintings are very, very fragile, especially because they were done, 3,000 or 4,000 years ago. Right, let me just see where we are here. Oh yeah, okay. So I wanted to, I think I started having you read this, but I want you to read this section of the text, just a short section, because again, it talks a little bit about Egyptian history and this old and middle and new kingdom, and a little bit about social hierarchy and women and slavery and all these things. So I'd like you to take some time to read this section, then we'll talk about it, and then we'll talk a little bit about Egyptian art. Yeah. So I'll give you some time to do that. Textbook is in Microsoft Teams, as always, and we'll answer these questions, okay? All right. Maybe just a few more minutes, 3 or 4 more minutes, if you can. Okay, good people. Hopefully that's enough time to have read and learned and understood and all that stuff. So this section kind of talks a little bit about how we kind of categorize Egyptian history, right? And it's a tricky thing because you've got thousands of years of history. How do you come to understand it? And one of them is by breaking it up into chunks, right? Chunks of time that make some sort of sense. And so here Egyptologists have broken it up into the Old Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom and the New Kingdom. And so what were these kind of kingdoms like? Why did they create these kind of categories?
Maybe use the pharaohs, the different pharaohs rule.
Yeah, there's different pharaohs, yeah.
Different way.
Different what?
Like they ruled in a different way.
Perhaps. There were what?
What was your question?
My question was, why did they choose to divide up Egyptian history this way? Mulder.
Intermediate periods that break them up.
Right, so there's these kingdoms, the old, the middle, and the new, and then there's these intermediate periods. And so what's the difference between the kingdoms and the intermediate periods?
In the kingdoms, the pharaohs
Yeah, so during these periods, they're kind of periods of stability, right? And so in the old, in the middle, and the new kingdom, things kind of are going fairly smoothly. Pharaohs are, ruling, and then they die, and then another pharaoh replaces them. Society is fairly stable, trade is fairly stable. Not much is really happening. Things are kind of, it's business as usual, if you will. But then in the intermediate periods, those things kind of fall apart a little bit, right? So sometimes there's chaos, sometimes there's military violence, sometimes the pharaoh has kind of lost some prestige or power, and so the governors of all the provinces of Egypt are, have sort of taken control of their own area, and they're just doing whatever they want. In some cases, there's a foreign invasion to deal with. So these intermediate periods are kind of periods of, of upheaval, of chaos, of crazy things happening, right? Whereas during the kingdoms, it's just kind of business as usual, pharaoh after pharaoh, general stability for the population, right? So they've kind of divided it up that way. What?
Sure, Mike?
Yeah.
Can we say that maybe because they traveled from one place to another, from like the south to the north,
Who traveled from the south to the north?
like they reached to Lebanon?
Right. Oh, yeah. So during the middle and the new kingdom, right, Egypt sets out on foreign conquest, right? So in the old kingdom, Egypt doesn't really have an army to speak of. They've never really been attacked by anyone, nor do they really want to take over anything else. And so it's kind of it's not a very strong kind of military period. But the middle and the new kingdom, that's a good point. Pharaohs are interested in conquering new lands, right, and expanding Egypt's power, right? So they go out on conquest and they try to conquer other areas of the world. And yeah, Lebanon, it fits into that category. Palestine or the Levant is captured by the Egyptians. Parts of Mesopotamia, they move further south into Nubia. And so, yeah, in those kingdoms, they try to gain more land for glory, but also because that means cash, right? That means money. What was the Egyptian social hierarchy like? Pharaoh's at the top, right? As a god, basically, right? A god on earth. He's at the top. Who else do we have in society?
Slaves,
Okay, well, who would you put in the elite category? Who?
nobles.
Nobles, right? So people in Egypt, in ancient Egypt, who would have maybe a prestigious family name or lots of money or lots of land. Those are kind of the nobles. Who else?
Slaves,
Slaves are in there too, right? So they're probably at the bottom of society, which is where they usually are, unfortunately.
but they also said slaves might not be at the bottom because like whenever a pharaoh dies, they kill around 1,000 slaves.
Well, I think the textbook pretty clearly said that probably wasn't often the case. There were stories about it, but probably didn't quite happen very often.
So we don't know if they're like in the bottom.
There was no what?
So like we don't know if they're like all of them they're in the bottom. Maybe like some slaves had like high position.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, it's tricky to know because as a slave you have kind of no social or political power, but depending on your position, you may be able to kind of leverage your position for more power, but you're still not free, right? So we've got slaves. Who else do we have? Skilled craftspeople. Okay, so people who can make things that society needs, whether it's jewelry or clay pots or chariots or some sort of technology, right? Metal workers, glass workers. Who else do we have? Farmers, lots and lots of farmers, right? So still, even though people are free to do other things in this society and there's lots of different occupations, there's still lots and lots of farmers, right? Because that's who's feeding everyone and supporting the whole thing. Baha says there's priests as well. Yeah, there's lots and lots of priests. We said Egypt is a very religious society. They have lots of different gods. So there's going to be lots of temples and lots of priests in them to do the appropriate rituals. Do I have a picture? Oh yeah, I do. Yeah, so something like this is a little picture, a little representation of what Egyptian society would look like, right? So, of course, the pharaoh is on top. We've got some high-ranking government officials below him, right? So, sort of a vizier or a prime minister or some sort of chief advisor to the pharaoh. We've got high priests who are, looking after the sort of major religious functions that the pharaoh has to participate in. Various nobles who have money and power and influence. And we've got lots of soldiers below them. It's interesting that soldiers are so high, but we've got scribes, people who know how to read and write. Probably some of the only people in society that know how to read and write. Most of these people would have been illiterate, probably. We have merchants, right? And merchants, they make money by selling things, and so they can have some power based on their economic position. There's our craftspeople that we talked about, our peasant farmers, and then our slaves at the bottom who are owned by others, right? Oh yeah, rights and freedoms of women. This was interesting. What kind of rights and freedoms and abilities do women have?
They can buy land.
Yeah, they can buy and own land. They can own property. That's pretty good for the ancient world, right? Lots of ancient societies and even not so ancient societies, women could not hold land, right? But here in ancient Egypt they can. What else can they do?
They can divorce if they want.
Sure, they can get divorced from their husband. Again, there's lots of societies, ancient and maybe not so ancient, in which divorce was not an option. What else? They can have. I think they said. Did they say that?
Yes.
I think they could have careers, right? Their primary role was as wife and mother, but they could actually do things, right? What else?
They could own, I think they could own 1/3 of the property.
Right. So they were entitled to 1/3 of the property and the wealth that a couple amasses during their time together. So if a woman gets married to a man and they're together for 20 years and then they get a divorce, she's not left with nothing, right? She gets 1/3 of whatever they have, whether it's a house or land or money or whatever it happens to be. She gets 1/3 of that, right? Which again, not all ancient or not so ancient societies were like that, right? Nowadays it's half and half, right? But for the ancient world, 1/3 is not bad for the ancient world. Irene says there were female pharaohs as well. Yeah, not many of them, but a few do manage to gain control. Hatshepsut is probably the most famous one. But what's interesting about her is that she has, it's supposed to be her son. Her young son is supposed to be Pharaoh. But of course, because he's 5 years old, he can't be Pharaoh. And so she steps in and becomes the ruler for him. And it's interesting because when you see her portrayed, when you see her in statues, she's portrayed kind of as a man. She's kind of wearing the crown of Egypt, but she also has a beard, which I assume she would have just tied on. But it's a symbol of kingship. And so she's a woman, but she's sort of portrayed as a man in some respects. But yeah, she's a pharaoh. Cleopatra is another famous Egyptian pharaoh, but she comes much, much later. And she's not even Egyptian. She's Greek. So she kind of doesn't count. But yeah, so spoiler alert, but Alexander the Great, who will come down from northern Greece, from Macedon, will conquer all of the ancient world. He will die. his general Ptolemy will take over Egypt after Alexander dies, and then the Ptolemy family will kind of rule Egypt for centuries after. And so Cleopatra is a descendant of Ptolemy, and so she's a Greek. She's not an Egyptian, but she rules as a pharaoh anyway. But that comes way later. Yeah, but there's female pharaohs. What do we know about slavery in Egypt? They could what?
They could get pardoned anytime.
Okay, so there's so we know slavery does exist. We know that slaves could be freed. I think the textbook says it doesn't happen very often, but it was possible for you to be freed and made a free member of society. What else do we know? Yeah, some of them served in the army. Yeah.
Most of them are prisoners of war or slaves from
Right. So most slaves wouldn't have been kind of ethnic or sort of they wouldn't have been culturally Egyptian. They would have come from somewhere else. What else?
whenever a pharaoh dies, they kill them to bury them together.
I don't know that that's the case.
They said in the next,
I thought they said that they did not.
like they almost killed like 1,000.
No, let's find that. Let's clarify this. Let's clarify what the text says. Oh, here. Does anyone see it yet? Because I know they mentioned this.
Always the first. I think it's in page 47.
What's that? No, that's what I thought I read too. Okay, hang on. It's on, yeah, it's on 47.
47, it's some masters undoubtedly abuse their slaves.
Sure, always the case, unfortunately.
Give thousands of slaves sacrificed to be buried with others.
Yeah, so here it is. So some masters undoubtedly abuse their slaves, though the image of thousands of slaves sacrificed to be buried with pharaohs incorrectly depicts dynastic Egypt. And that's true because there was this kind of cultural idea, I think, that Egypt was built with slaves, and there's thousands of slaves working on the pyramids to create these things. And again, the research shows that that's probably not the case. It's probably regular Egyptians just paying their taxes, right? You don't pay your taxes in money, you pay your tax in work, and you go off to work on the pharaoh's, maybe not the pharaoh's tomb, but you go off to work on a temple or a building or something for 2 months out of the year, and those are your taxes, right? So yeah, most of these things are built by regular Egyptians just paying their taxes. Now, you could you could make an argument that the taxation is slavery because those people aren't able to not do it, but they're not owned by the pharaoh, but they have to work for him for part of the year. And so yeah, so even though there were certainly slaves in ancient Egypt, and probably a number of them, it probably wasn't kind of it wasn't a society that was sort of built on slave labor, maybe the way that we kind of culturally imagined it to be in the past, but there were still slaves. But in some ways they're hard to, they're hard to sort of quantify sometimes because you might not have legal records about them. They wouldn't have been able to read or write. And so, they're, in many cases, they're kind of invisible in society, right? They don't leave a lot behind. And so it's hard to know for sure. But they did exist. And so last one, what were some of the characteristics of the Old Kingdom? So that early period of stability in Egypt. What's that? Yeah, it probably was pretty peaceful. It was probably a period where civilization got increasingly complex and the pharaohs got increasingly powerful, pretty stable. What else?
Pyramids were a huge thing.
Yeah, big pyramids get built in the Old Kingdom, right? They don't really do it so much in the Middle Kingdom and definitely not in the New Kingdom. But in the Old Kingdom, they are into pyramids, right? And they build really big ones. The biggest ones ever, in fact. Ones that are still there today. What else? Old Kingdom. Old Kingdom stuff.
Didn't really have much warfare going on.
Yeah, probably a pretty quiet period for them in terms of foreign involvement, right? So no invasions. They didn't seem to be worried about being invaded because they had no army to speak of. So probably like a bit of a cultural high watermark, if you will, right? It's very peaceful. Lots of, lots of things are happening in terms of culture and religion, but not a lot of upheaval. Just kind of smooth sailing for Egypt, right? Whoops. Okay. Let me just check my notes here. Okay, let's take a little break. We've been working hard here. Come back, and we'll talk a little bit about Egyptian art. Okay, take a break, and we'll come back. Okay, and we are back. So one of the things that's kind of interesting about Egypt and that's interesting about these kind of dynastic period is that kind of theme of stability. And again, for a long time, for thousands of years, Egypt is a very stable, consistent, conservative society, right? And part of that has to do with the environment. Again, they don't have a lot of outside influence. Egypt is difficult to get to thousands of years ago because they have horrible, dry, hot desert all around them, so it's difficult to get to them. So they don't have to deal with foreign invaders. They have a very sort of rich, their farmland is able to produce lots of food. They've got lots of natural resources, and they have this very kind of idyllic civilization for thousands of years. And again, keep in mind the length of, think about this. So Tutankhamen is a New Kingdom pharaoh, right? And we know him from the video. He's around in, 1300 BCE, so 3,300 years ago or so. But when he's born, or when he's a young child, let's say, he's 10 years old, he's about to become pharaoh, the Great Pyramid has already been standing for 2,000 years. Like, that's part of his culture and part of his civilization, and it's been standing there for 2,000 years. And it's the same culture and the same civilization. So think about that sort of sense of tradition, that sense of history that, is consistent for so long. Amazing, especially nowadays when our culture seems to be changing by the minute almost. Think of the kind of consistency that the Egyptians had. One of the ways that we can see this consistency is in their writing and the things that they say, but also in their art. Because that's one of the things that's very interesting about Egyptian art is that it is very conservative. It's very consistent. They do things the same way for a long time. One of the things I'll point out about ancient Egyptian art is that it is very stylized and it is symbolic. What does stylized mean in an art term? When it's what? When it's styled in a certain way, okay. Right, it's custom. But if something is stylized, what does it mean? Yeah, often it is. Often it is, yeah. Let me think. Does anyone watch Rick and Morty? Rick and Morty? Yeah. So Rick and Morty it's an animated show, right? Rick and Morty are both stylized humans, right? So you see them in the cartoon, you recognize that they're both supposed to be humans, right? Both Rick and Morty are human beings. But does any real human look like that? No, they're not anatomically perfect, right? They're stylized. They're meant to look like humans. You're meant to recognize them to be humans, but they're not accurate. They're not anatomically accurate, right? The Simpsons are the same thing, right? The Simpsons are stylized humans. They're not perfect representations of humans. But Egyptian art is very stylized and, again, very symbolic. So have a look at this picture here. And we've seen this picture once before. Again, it's from the Book of the Dead. We see that very popular scene of the heart being weighed by Anubis there, and Tot, the god of scribes, is there to write down the verdict. But this scene has a lot of elements of Egyptian art that are kind of peculiar, but very consistent for thousands of years. So one thing I'll show you right off the bat, or one thing you might notice, is how these people are standing. Does anyone really stand like that? Because their feet are like both pointing the same way, and then like their hips are kind of pointed one way, but then their chest seems to be like square with the painting, right? So their chest is facing you, but their feet are facing this way, and then their heads are facing this way, and then their like hands are moving in some other way. Like it's very bizarre, kind of, but nobody walks like that, right? Like nobody walks with their body rotated in such a weird kind of way, right? But again, many characters are drawn like this, right? With the feet going one way, the sort of hips and chest facing the viewer, and then the head going directly sideways, right? Nobody's looking out at you. Nobody's looking off in the distance. Everybody's looking this way, as are their feet, but the rest of their body seems to be rotated towards you in kind of a weird fashion. Again, that's stylistic, right? It's not true to life. It's a very odd kind of pose. What else can I show you? They've always got those curved fingers are very common too. You see how the woman here, you see her fingers are kind of like curvy. Her hand is kind of curvy. You see that a lot too. Most people don't have hands that quite curve that way. You see that a lot. What else do we see? Oh, these figures are different sizes, right? And so look at, yeah, what's that? The arm and the leg? What do you mean? They what? They are in real life? Fingers? Yeah, I mean, a little bit, but they're kind of, again, they're not anatomically perfect, right? They're kind of stylized that way very often. Look at the size of the figures, though. So here's the pharaoh, and he's portrayed as Horus because he's got the falcon's head. And then Anubis is here. Is Anubis really this tall? The god Anubis, is he that tall? No, it's not that, but the Egyptians kind of mix up the sizes of people. So the sort of relative size of the characters doesn't have to do with how big they actually are. It has to do with how important they are in the scene, right? So the pharaoh is really important here in the scene, as is, I'm assuming, his wife, but I'm not sure. And then Anubis is here too, but he's not as important a part of the scene, so he's smaller, right? And then look at all these characters up here. They're really tiny, right? But so the Egyptians do that. They kind of mix the sizes of characters, but it has to do with importance in the image. It doesn't have to do with real life sizing, and it doesn't have to do with perspective either, right? Because none of these have any perspective. There's no depth, right? Nothing is ever happening behind or in front, like we see in some more modern paintings. Everything's happening just in some sort of two-dimensional plane, right? Let me see, what else can I show you? Oh yeah, something interesting going on here too. We've seen this one before. I think it's from the tomb of Tutankhamen, and here Tutankhamun's young wife is performing the opening of the mouth ceremony, right? And there's Anubis behind him, sort of, soothing him, saying, "It's okay, Tutankhamen, everything's fine," with his weird curvy fingers. But look at the difference in the skin tone. So Anubis is one color, and Tutankhamen is one color, but his wife her skin tone seems to be different. You see that? Why do you think that is? She's what? Ooh, interesting. She's alive. That definitely works for Osiris, right? Because Osiris is dead, and we always see him as that kind of greenish gray color. Good thought. Not correct, but good thought. Basil, what?
I just have a question for the previous slide.
Oh, sure, okay.
The woman on the right, she's like stabbed with knives and all that.
Yeah, I don't know what's going on with her.
There's like knives like stuck into their hands into the wall.
Yeah, she seems to have, can I zoom in on her? No. She's got a lot of she seems to be holding the feather of truth, and she might be like a representation of Mat, that sort of eternal force of balance. Sometimes we see that kind of abstract concept shown as the feather, symbolizes the feather. Sometimes that concept is symbolized as a human, and that could be her.
But like, if you see her hands and her arms, there's like blood.
It almost looks like there is, right?
Like there is like blood on her arms, her elbow, and as if like there's a knife that's been put through her hand.
I think that's a shadow.
Either way, I'm not entirely sure what's.
And the woman beside the pharaoh also is covered in blood.
Yeah.
Everyone has a red shadow.
Yeah, it's interesting. I wonder, and Pharaoh seems to have a little bit too. So yeah, it could be shadow, could be blood, it could be. I don't know about ancient Egyptian custom, but often you'll see that when someone dies, people in mourning will dirty themselves in some way, right? They'll like pour dirt over their head, or rub on their face, or.
The gods have them as well. The red just looks more visible because she's wearing white.
Right. Yeah, we see it here a little bit as well. Yeah, it could just be shadow. Could be sort of symbolic of like mourning. Yeah, I'm not sure. I think she might be a representation of that concept of Mat, but again, I'm not an Egyptologist, so I could be wrong. But I think that's who that is, maybe. And I think this is Pharaoh's wife. I think that's Pharaoh. I don't know. This might be Mat again up here. She's got the feather of truth on her head. What's up?
So like they used to put the one feather on the heart to
Well, it's not a real feather. It's a metaphorical feather. So the feather is kind of weighing the heart against truth,
so
right?
it's like feather heavy.
I think they're supposed to balance. I don't know if it's a heavy or lightness thing, but it's a metaphorical thing. So is your heart in alignment with the sort of universal principle of good and evil and right and wrong and the nature of the universe? Is your heart in alignment with that? If it is, then you may enter. So the weighing is actually like, the weighing is a judgment, right? Is your heart pure? Is it good? Were you a good person? It's kind of a metaphorical way to think about that. Okay, so skin tone. Why is his wife lighter colored?
Maybe just the paint.
Well, it's definitely the paint, but it's on purpose. What did you say? Maybe possibly she is Egyptian, although it's probably interesting to think about the fact that Egyptians were probably a much darker skinned people than we sometimes think. What's that?
There's like a place in Egypt called the Hub. It's like where the poor people and like the blue hall is there. Every citizen is black. Because like due to the sun and water.
Right. Because of what?
Because like they go swimming a lot.
Yep.
And there's a lot of sun.
There's a lot of sun.
Yeah, it's so hot there.
A lot of sun.
Get danced.
Yeah. So two things. So Egypt now is kind of a little bit different than Egypt then, right? Because Egypt now is full of people of Arab descent because the Arabs came and conquered that area. But the Egyptians in the past were probably sort of a collection of different skin tones, although probably darker than we might think. But they were still kind of all seen as Egyptians, except for maybe the sort of very black people who came from what we now know as Sudan. So the Egyptians were kind of in Egypt, and then if you go south, you would encounter Sudanese people who were sort of darker skinned. But here, the sun is interesting because you probably had men outside working in the fields, right? Men outside, doing the work or farming, and women, most of their work might have been done inside, right? Raising the kids or looking after the kids. So might men have been a slightly different color than women? Could be, right? So
They used to distinguish between female and male.
what's that?
Like to show who's the male and who's the female.
Yeah. It's a stylistic representation of men and women, right? So you often see this. You often see men having a darker skin tone and women having a lighter one in Egyptian art. And so not only do they have a very specific way of drawing people, they have a very specific way of coloring individuals as well. And so women are usually shown with a kind of lighter skin tone than men are, even though I doubt Pharaoh was working in the fields very often, but still he's shown with darker skin. Yeah, here's an example of all of those things happening at once. I think another tomb painting, I think, is where this is from, but you can see the different sizes of characters, right? So there's some big, some small. You can see their kind of bizarre body posture. You can see the different skin tones. All of that is there. And again, consistent for thousands of years, right? This very consistent art style. And again, this art style is religious, right? And religion is very, reluctant to change ever, right? Religion doesn't change very quickly. And so because their art is kind of symbolic and religious in nature, it kind of stays the same for a long time as well. Yeah. Another one, you can see different sizes of characters, different skin tones, the body posture, the fact that there's a bunch of people, a bunch of characters sitting up here. I think these are other gods, but I'm not entirely positive. Yeah, you can see all that stuff happening. Sometimes we see stuff in relief. So this is carved on stone. The pharaoh as Horus, right? You see he's got the crown of Upper and Lower Egypt on his head. Falcon head. Whoa. The other thing we have is lots of sculpture from Egypt. And here we see stylization and sort of consistency again, right? So here's these three pharaohs, right? And, there are some differences, right? We can see some differences in features in terms of noses and mouths, but do you think you would recognize any of these guys if they were walking down the street? Well, this is the third crown. So there's different crowns for Egypt. That sort of bowling pin one, which is white, is the one for Upper Egypt. The sort of red one with the little lizard tongue coming out of it, that one's the one for Lower Egypt. And this is called the Nemes crown. And I don't know when you wear one or the other. I don't know what dictates when you wear, but the Nemes crown they're often shown wearing as well. And so you can see them. It's got this kind of, so it goes over the head. It's got these side pieces, and it's usually got a little, sometimes they're a vulture and sometimes a vulture and a snake, which are the protectors of the pharaohs. So sometimes you'll see that up there too. So yeah, these guys are all pharaohs. They're wearing the Nemes crown. They've got their sort of beard, which is another symbol of kingship. But again, are they that distinctive? Not really, right? They're kind of, they're still a little stylized, right? You might see a little bit of the pharaoh's true face in here, but think about, do you remember when we saw the video on Tutankhamen and they did a computer reconstruction of his face? Did that look anything like his golden death mask? No, not at all, right? So again, this sort of, there's a lot of emphasis on stylization, right? These pharaohs don't actually look that different, right? There's a few facial differences, but they are heavily stylized. And you see the same thing in the sort of posture of these people too. And so here's the pharaoh. I think this is the pharaoh that built the second biggest pyramid. So this is Khafre or Cheops. Is it Cheops? Khafre or Cheops? Cheops is the Greek. Khufu's the father. Khafre is the son. So this is the son, the second biggest pyramid, and his wife. But again, they're quite stylized, but look how they're standing. Is this a natural looking pose?
Maybe they like walking.
Maybe they do. But people don't walk like this. Like they're both standing there. They've got their left foot forward. They've got their arms straight down at their sides in fists, except for her, and she's got this.
He's trying to stop him. Maybe he's angry. He's trying to fight.
Maybe he's just about to like step off a cliff, right? This is not an entirely natural. This is not an entirely natural pose. This is very stiff, very kind of robotic. Compare it to this one here, for instance. So this is a Michelangelo sculpture from the Renaissance. But look how much movement there is, right? There's like stretching out, and it's very realistic, right? The muscles, what's that?
The reflex.
Yeah, they're the muscles, the head. People are looking at each other and they're fighting with these serpents in a biblical story. There's a lot of realism and energy and movement there, right? And compare that with this, which is very kind of stiff and unrealistic. And again, it's not because the Egyptians couldn't carve realistically, it's because they didn't want to, right? This was their style. It had religious value, and this is what they did. Interestingly, you'll see that lots of other civilizations copy this as well. So when the Greeks start making statues, the Greek statues are posed exactly like these ones. They're standing there with their arms at their side, with their left foot forward. So again, people copy ancient Egypt, even in the ancient world. Right, so most of ancient Egyptian art is very stable and consistent and the same for thousands of years. But there was one period where it changed, and it had to do with this dude here, Akhenaten. And so Akhenaten is a new kingdom pharaoh. He's actually the father of Tutankhamen, believe it or not. And he's kind of a big deal in Egyptian history because of what he does to ancient Egyptian religion. So shortly after he becomes pharaoh, the priests are gaining too much power, the priests of Amun. And so they don't want to listen to what Pharaoh has to say. They're disobeying him and kind of doing what they want. And so Akhenaten, as a young pharaoh who was called Amenhotep IV at that time, he said, you know what? I'm going to change this. I don't want to deal with these priests of Amun who think that they can call the shots around here. I'm the pharaoh. And so he changes the state religion. And so instead of everyone worshiping Amun-Ra or Amun, instead he changes the state's religion to be one that worships Aton, which is the sun's disk. How that's different from Amun, I don't know. You'd have to understand Egyptian religion better than I do. But he basically starts worshiping a different god so that all those priests of Amun have no power over him anymore. So he proclaims that Aton is the god that everybody should be worshiping, changes the state religion, moves his capital to a new place here. And again, we don't have any record of this. I'll explain why in a second. It might have looked something like this. Now it looks something like this. This is Akhenaten's former capital. But have a look at the artwork from Akhenaten's reign. So here he is. He and his wife are worshiping Aton, the disk, the sun's disk. But some really different things are happening here, right? Look at how Akhenaten is styled, right? He's kind of a little curvier. He looks like he has a bit of a belly, right? He looks like he's been, enjoying some food. All those other pharaohs look like they were spending time in the gym, right? Here he is, he looks a little rounder, right? A little bit curvier. Look at, here's a sculpture or a bust of his face. That's a really different looking face for Egyptian art, right? All those other Egyptians looked almost the same, but he seems to have he's got these big lips and big ears and a chin and cheekbones, and he's got a totally different look. Here he is again. Very different, right? Look how curvy he is, almost feminine in a way, right? And this face is actually one that looks much more like you could actually recognize him in the street, right? You can see a little more character in his face, still stylized. This is a pretty famous sculpture or bust of Nefertiti, who is, I think, supposed to be Akhenaten's wife and maybe Tutankhamun's mother. And she looks very realistic, does she not? And pretty beautiful too. But yeah, this is a much different look from the very kind of stylized, sort of rounded out features of the other sculptures and the other pharaohs. This is much more realistic. Have a look at this here. Here's Akhenaten and his wife playing with their kids, right? And so, again, they look kind of strange, right? Their faces are kind of, and their heads are kind of stretched out in a strange way. But like their noses and their lips and their eyes are very exaggerated. They're very curvy. You can see Akhenaten's got a bit of a belly there. And really what's interesting here is that how natural this is, right? So imagine back a couple of paintings where we looked at the statue of Khafre, right, with his wife, and they're very stiffly holding each other with no expression on their face at all, right? And what's happening here? Well, they're playing with their kids, right? So there's, I think, Akhenaten's daughter sitting on her mom's knee, right? Maybe her mom's bouncing her like, parents like to do. And then what's Akhenaten doing? He's got his son in his arms, right? He's giving him a little kiss. You never see this. You never see this in any other period of Egyptian history, this kind of naturalistic, kind of heartwarming scene of people actually being people, right? Of, the pharaoh and his wife, sitting there playing with their kids, tickling them and kissing them and things like that. You don't see that anywhere except for Akhenaten stuff.
Why is there a third child on the mother's shoulder?
Oh yeah, there's a little third child there too. Could be a little baby. I'm not sure how many kids they had, but yeah, actually I missed that. But yeah, there's a third child there.
Well, I know they're like two, and they marry each other.
There might have been a third one. I don't know for sure. Clearly there's one shown. But yeah, so here they are, and there's Aton, the sun's disk, shining down and blessing them, and here they are playing with their kids. And again, you never see this. You never see this in any other form of artwork. So yeah, we see, during Akhenaten, we see a break from state religion, a new capital, but also different art, right? And so the art is much more naturalistic. There's a bit of a sense of movement. The human figures, or at least Akhenaten and his wife, are much kind of curvier, and sort of different parts of their faces are exaggerated. And again, the pharaoh is doing naturalistic activities. You never see Pharaoh playing with his kids in any other, for thousands of years, you never see him playing with his kids except for in Akhenaten's art. Yeah, here's young Tutankhamen. Of course, at the time he was called Tutankhaten, so he had Aten in his name. So here he is with his wife, right? And look what she's doing. What's she doing? What's she doing? No, she's giving him flowers. I know they're brother and sister, and it's gross. But that aside, It's cute, right? She's giving her husband flowers. Isn't that cute? Yeah, it's really cute. But you don't see this kind of thing any other time in ancient Egypt except with Akhenaten and very early in Tutankhamun's reign, because Tutankhamun is his son. Oh yeah, check this out too. 2 kids.
They look like our modern interpretation of aliens.
A little bit. Yeah, they are kind of alien looking in a way, right? They've got kind of big heads and their eyes, and they do look a little strange. Yeah, you can see this on Tutankhamun's throne as well. This is the throne of Tutankhamun that was found in his tomb. The last thing I'll say before I let you go is that this sort of new stylistic period in Egyptian art doesn't last very long. Akhenaten will die, probably murdered. His switch of state religion went against thousands of years of history and precedent, and so nobody really liked it, and so he was probably assassinated. And that's what allowed Tutankhamun to come to power. And of course, Tutankhamun was just a boy, and so those around him quickly changed everything back to the way it originally was. And so the art went back to normal. The religion went back to the worship of Amun, and Akhenaten's new capital was destroyed at El Amarna. That's why there's nothing left. They tore it to the ground. They removed his name from any inscriptions and basically tried to forget him. So Tutankhaten, his son, his name was changed to Tutankhamun. And so they basically wiped him clean, and he disappeared without a trace, in a way. And that's what leads us into Tutankhamun. So Horemheb and I are sort of the ones who are running the state for Tutankhamun, and then Tutankhamun will become Pharaoh. But then he dies, and I think, Horemheb succeeds him, and refers to Akhenaten as the criminal Akhenaten and erases him. Whew. Anyway, that is all the time we have. Tomorrow, come back. We will summarize ancient Egypt, and then we will move on to something that's next. I forget what's next. We'll move on to something that's next. Okay, that's all I have. Have a good afternoon. I will see you tomorrow. Goodbye.